The dark moved first. Not the ships. Not the alarms. The dark. At 3:11 station time, every long-range scope on the Halcyon boundary array registered the same impossible distortion in the same patch of outer sky, a wedge of black where there should have been stars. The first watch officer at Station Ilya marked it as sensor bleed. The second marked it as gravitational lensing. The third, a woman named Mara Denev on watchpost Cinder, stared at the display for 6 full seconds before filing the only report that turned out to be honest. Something is covering the stars. 3 stations. 3 reports. 42 seconds apart. By 3:13, 9 more platforms had confirmed the anomaly. By 3:14, the scopes had begun recalibrating themselves because the software responsible for distinguishing shadow from mass had not been written with the expectation that anything in known space would be large enough to produce that kind of shadow without also announcing itself through every other channel first. By 3:16, the software had given up pretending it understood what it was seeing and started labeling the whole region with the clean, unhelpful language machines use when reality becomes embarrassing. Unresolved object cluster. At 3:17, the first vessel crossed into mapped space. No flare. No warning bloom. No staggered arrival pattern. It simply occupied coordinates that had been empty 1 second earlier and were not empty anymore. A black shape so vast the scope had to reduce magnification twice before it could fit the whole thing on the screen. Then another vessel arrived. Then 4. Then 12 more in a geometry too precise to be accidental and too composed to be called military in any normal sense. By 3:21 there were 21. By 3:25 there were 38. By 3:29 the stations stopped counting vessels one at a time and started counting the gaps between them, because the gaps were easier for the human brain to process than the ships themselves. The fleet did not deploy the way fleets deploy. It did not fan out in attack posture, did not tighten into defensive screen, did not maneuver like anything built by a species that thought in terms of fronts and flanks and firing arcs. It arranged itself in the dark with the patient certainty of something placing pieces exactly where they had always intended to go. From the outer watch stations, from the relay telescopes, from civilian observatories that should not have had clearance but were now pointed there anyway because the whole system had started hearing rumors, the shape became visible. Not random. Not tactical. Written. That was Mara Denev's second report, sent with a hand that only shook after she hit transmit. It looks like writing. Command laughed at that for 11 seconds. Then 6 separate linguistic AIs running on 6 separate stations submitted concordance alerts within half a minute of each other. Human analysts were pulled out of sleep rotations and pushed into language bays with coffee and authorization overrides. The old archive banks were opened. Dead syntaxes were dusted off. Fossil tongues from species that no longer existed except in museum cylinders and badly translated funerary tablets were compared against the shape of the fleet. At 3:46, the first conclusion went up the chain. At 3:49, the second matched it. At 3:52, 12 living and extinct language families had all landed on the same translation. The formation was a name. Not a warning. Not a greeting. A name. On the command deck of Boundary Fortress Aster, Admiral Elian Rose stood in front of the main glass and read the translated file without changing expression. He was a hard man to impress and an even harder man to frighten, which was why High Command liked him on the edge stations where the first strange thing always arrived wearing its worst face. He read the word once. Then again. Then a third time, because disciplined people repeat the unbelievable until it either becomes believable or stays unbelievable long enough to justify action. It stayed unbelievable. The name rendered differently in different archives. One extinct marine species translated it as the Beforeborn. A shattered lithic dialect from the Pelagos ruins translated it as those who came prior. An imperial funerary code recovered from a dead moon in the Kylen Reach translated it as First Authority. The common human rendering, the one the AIs agreed would preserve the meaning most cleanly, was simpler. The originals. Nobody on Aster said anything for a while after that. Outside the glass, the ships held position in a crescent so wide the eye could not take it in whole. Each vessel was less like a ship than a decision made out of black architecture. They had no running lights. They needed none. Their outlines existed by the absence around them, by what they denied the sky permission to show. Some were narrow and cathedral tall, ribbed with structures that suggested purpose without revealing it. Others were broad, severe masses with smooth surfaces that swallowed starlight and gave nothing back. One of the junior officers quietly whispered that they looked like cities taught how to hate. No one told him to repeat himself. The outer colonies began calling in before dawn cycle. Civilian comm traffic spiked so hard that local relay towers throttled non-essential channels automatically. Observatory feeds leaked. Someone on a mining habitat 3 systems and posted a still frame of the fleet silhouette with the caption, "I think God just parked outside," and by the time station moderators deleted it, the image had already propagated across 17 public networks and 3 military ones. At 4:07 station time, the fleet transmitted. Not from a flagship. Not from the lead vessel. The signal came from the space between the ships, as if the formation itself were only an organ and something larger was speaking through it. It hit standard radio first, then laser relays, then quantum entanglement lines, then backup analog receivers that had no business hearing anything across that range. On watchpost Cinder, Mara Deneuve felt the console under her palms vibrate with a frequency too low to be called sound and too deliberate to be called interference. The bridge speakers came alive. The voice that emerged was not loud. Loud was a thing measured by volume. This was measured by weight. It rolled through the station with the slow, immovable certainty of something that had never once in its history needed to introduce itself twice. Several crew members later reported pressure in their ribs. One technician vomited quietly into a waste bin and kept monitoring his board because there are moments so large that embarrassment simply does not survive them. The translation software lagged by 3 seconds. When it caught up, the first line appeared across every command screen in a flat white strip of text. "Children of the late fire, your waiting is concluded." No one moved. The second line came slower, as if whoever spoke understood perfectly well the effect of timing. "You are witnessed." Then the third. "Tent." Admiral Rowe looked through the glass at the black crescent hanging across human space, at the stars missing behind it, at the impossible stillness of 38 vessels that had arrived like a verdict. Around him, hardened officers with 20 years on frontier postings stood frozen over their stations with faces gone carefully blank, the way trained people go blank when they do not yet know which emotion is safe to have. On 16 border platforms and 100 civilian screens and 1 mining habitat where a mechanic had forgotten to blink, humanity looked into the dark and understood 3 things at once. Something old had arrived. It believed the meeting had been arranged long before humans were born. And whatever happened next, it was not here to ask permission. High Consecrant Severith stood in the light chamber of the Sanctum vessel and watched the yellow star ahead with the calm satisfaction of a being arriving exactly on time. Not early. Not late. Exactly on time. His species had 23 words for forms of waiting and 9 for the emotional states produced by fulfilled expectation. Human language, according to the pre-contact archives, had fewer distinctions in that area. Human language, Severith had already decided, was probably serviceable for commerce and tool use and emergency communication, but unlikely to be adequate for revelation. Most species were like that at first. Their words improved once they entered proper alignment with reality. He stood on 6 limbs arranged in the old consecration posture, foregrounded, 2 lifted slightly from the polished black floor of the chamber as the vessel's inner bioluminescent veins breathed gold through the walls. Behind him, the chamber rose in nested arcs toward a transparent ceiling panel that framed the local star with deliberate care. The room had been built for this work. Every line in it guided the eye upward. Every frequency in it favored awe. Every reflective surface had been chosen according to studies performed across 11 civilizations and 40 centuries of conversion history. The architecture did not command belief. It prepared the body to recognize it. Severith approved of preparation. He was large by the standards of his kind, though size had never mattered much among the auric lineages. Precision mattered. Control mattered. The disciplined arrangement of force in the service of higher truth mattered. His skin shifted slowly through dark cobalt and ash gold beneath the chamber lights, an unconscious response to thought depth and emotional regulation. His lower eyes, set wide for field awareness, remained fixed on the star. His upper eyes scanned the tactical overlays flowing in translucent script above the chamber rail. 38 vessels in contact formation. Boundary stations identified. Civilian traffic spike within projected range. Linguistic penetration successful. Initial message delivery complete. All metrics were on schedule. He had spent 71 years in consecration ministry and had presided over the alignment of 4 species personally. Before that, he had served as second attendant to a high voice during the Varn integration and had watched an oceanic civilization fall to devotional stillness in under 19 hours. Before that, he had studied under Preceptor Holland, who taught him that revelation was not an argument and could not be treated like one. Arguments were for uncertain things. Revelation was an environmental condition. You arranged the conditions correctly, and belief followed as naturally as water followed gravity. That principle had never failed. Species resisted details. Species resisted tribute structures, tax revisions, labor allocations, doctrinal refinements, and the practical irritations that accompanied joining anything larger than themselves. But they did not resist the first moment. Not really. Not at the deepest level. At the deepest level, every thinking species feared the same 3 things: that the universe was empty, that their suffering had no witness, and that death concluded without explanation. Revelation addressed all 3 at once. That was why it worked. Not because the fleets were large, though they were. Not because the weapons were divine, though many civilizations had reasonably called them that. It worked because the truth being offered was one most minds were already desperate to receive. You are not alone. You were intended. Your fear has an answer. Severeth had delivered those meanings in one form or another 46 times. 46 successful receptions. 46 worlds drawn inward toward proper scale. 46 confirmations that the universe, when encountered correctly, recognized hierarchy. He moved one upper limb and the chamber dimmed slightly as tactical overlays rearranged themselves. To his left waited First Harmonic Terrell, keeper of frequency architecture. To his right stood General Caden of the outer arrays, broad-framed and motionless, his skin held in the matte bronze of contained readiness. Behind them, attendants and signal adepts lined the walls in reverent stillness, saying nothing because no one spoke casually in the light chamber once revelation had begun. Language used carelessly in sacred operations had a way of reducing the quality of outcomes. Severeth had observed that early in his career and had never tolerated it since. The human stations received the name without degradation, Terrell said at last. Her voice was low and melodically precise, tuned by decades of training to avoid disruptive harmonics. Translation concordance across extinct lexicons exceeded forecast. The phrase children of the late fire produced elevated stress markers in intercepted response chatter. Good, Severeth said. One word. No more than the matter required. General Caden inclined his head. No military repositioning yet. Their border assets remain static. There is increased internal comm traffic and a measurable rise in heat signatures across command decks. They are organizing their fear, Severeth said. Caden's lower hands flexed once. Yes. It was not mockery. Not from Severeth. Lesser species always did this part. They observed, categorized, transmitted, sought consensus, consulted command layers, checked instruments again in case reality had arrived malformed. It was procedural behavior generated by stress and uncertainty and the primitive hope that one more report might change what had already become true. He had seen it in avians, in lithics, in methane breathers, in a silicon cohesive polity that communicated through fracture resonance and had still somehow managed to produce the emotional equivalent of denial. Every species believed, for a little while, that its preferred internal mechanisms might mediate revelation into something familiar. They never did. By the second transmission, reverence generally began. By the third, formal surrender structures. By the fourth, supplication or offerings or attempts at devotional reciprocity. By the first planetary cycle's end, The old symbols began to come down. He had the numbers committed to memory because certainty was more beautiful when quantified. "Shall we proceed to full vocal architecture?" Terrell asked. Severith looked once more at the yellow star. Unexceptional. The sort of star that produced quick-lived oxygen systems and fragile upright creatures who built stories to keep the dark from feeling unoccupied. The archives on humanity suggested high creativity, moderate aggression, strong patterning instincts, persistent tribal fragmentation, unusual attachment to abstract liberty constructs, and a statistically above-average tendency to joke under duress. Severith considered the last trait mildly interesting and strategically irrelevant. Humor was one of fear's lesser exhaustions. It vented instability. It changed nothing. "Yes," he said. "Begin the greater address." Terrell touched the signal lattice. The chamber deepened in tone. Across the fleet, resonant cavities opened like lungs preparing to speak. Frequencies folded into one another, each chosen not merely for audibility but for physiological consequence. The old science. The faithful science. The one refined over centuries until the body understood significance before the mind had time to construct defenses around it. Belief was not planted in thought first. Thought came later, once sensation had already made room. Severith rested both upper hands on the chamber rail and allowed himself one private moment of satisfaction. Humanity would do as all civilizations eventually did. It would look upon force wrapped in purpose, hear the voice of age speaking certainty into its fragile little night, and understand at last what every species before it had understood. That existence without submission was merely confusion with better branding. The fleet breathed in. Then the dark spoke again. The greater address arrived on every channel at once. Not just military frequencies. Not just civilian bands. It slid through emergency relays, observatory feeds, deep freight transponders, weather satellites, mining drones, and one hospital nursery monitor in low orbit above Carthan where 3 newborns slept through the beginning of what later reports would call the most significant first contact event in recorded human history. On Boundary Fortress Aster, the bridge lights dimmed automatically as the main tactical glass handed priority over to translation display. The voice came through the station structure itself this time, through deck plating and support beams and speaker grids, so that for a moment it felt less like the humans were hearing it and more like the station had decided to speak in a language of weight. "We are the first before flame. We crossed the dark when your star was dust. We ordered the silence before your bones learned uprightness. You have endured the loneliness appropriate to the unfinished. That period is concluded." Several people on Aster stopped breathing without meaning to. One of the comms technicians later admitted under review that she had tears in her eyes by the third line and no idea whether they belonged to fear, awe, pain, or simple physiological overload. The low frequencies were doing things to muscle groups nobody liked discussing in official language. The med staff would eventually give it a technical designation. In the moment, it felt like being addressed by weather. "You are witnessed now. You are known. Lay down the burdens of self-definition. Receive the order that made you." The translation strip kept pace almost perfectly, a small miracle performed by software engineers who had not known, when they designed the system, that one day they would be expected to translate God into procedure at speed. The bridge of Aster remained still through the full 7-minute address. No one interrupted. No one could have if they wanted to. Every line arrived with the careful inevitability of a thing that had been practiced until perfection had replaced spontaneity. The message named the fleet as the Lantern of Origins. It named the speaker as High Consecrant Severith, voice of the first before flame, keeper of 11 harmonized peoples, witness-bearer of the ordered vast. It named humanity unfinished, beloved in ignorance, salvageable through alignment. It referenced civilizations old enough that the human archives had to dig for supporting material. It promised clarity. It promised peace. It promised entry into a structure older and kinder and more total than anything human political theory had ever managed to build. It ended with a sentence so clean in construction that 3 listeners would later describe hating it for being beautiful. Be relieved of choosing what you were never qualified to be. Then the channels went quiet. Not normal quiet. Loaded quiet. The kind that descends on rooms when something very large has just put its hand on the back of everyone's neck and taken it away again. On the main bridge of Aster, Admiral Elian Rowe looked at the dead glass for a count of 4. Then he lifted his mug, found it empty, looked into it as if disappointed specifically in the concept of emptiness, and set it back down. "Record full transmission," he said. The bridge stirred like a body remembering it had limbs. "Already running, sir," said Lieutenant Voss from Signals, voice tighter than she probably wanted. "Good. Forward to command. Full priority. Tag Xenocontact, strategic unknown, ideological incursion." "Yes, sir." Rowe turned slightly. "Medical." A medic near the rear console straightened. "Sir? Whatever they just did with the low band, I want to write up before someone starts calling it magic." "Yes, sir." Linguistics. A narrow man in civilian gray, pulled from archive duty 2 hours earlier and still wearing the expression of somebody who had expected a very different night, looked up from his station. "Admiral? How many pieces of that speech were built to land below conscious processing?" The linguist rubbed at one eye. "At first estimate? Most of it." "Estimate faster." "Yes, sir." No one laughed. There was almost a laugh hiding somewhere under the tension, but almost laughter and actual laughter are different species. The actual one had not arrived yet. At Watchpost Cinder, Mara Deneuve sat through the silence after the message and became aware, all at once, that her hands were gripping the edges of her console hard enough to hurt. She let go. Flexed her fingers. Checked her station boards, because checking boards is what trained people do when confronted with the incomprehensible. The fleet remained fixed beyond the boundary line, black and formal against the missing stars. Civilian chatter was detonating across the side screens. Prayer requests. Panic spikes. Market crashes already beginning in the outer exchanges. Someone on a civilian feed had clipped the line about burdens of self-definition and posted it with the caption "Absolutely not," and the post was multiplying faster than moderation could catch it. Mara blinked at it once, then brought up First Contact Protocol. The file was older than she was and arranged in the deeply unromantic structure of all good survival documents. Unknown species. Unknown intent. Unknown capability. Initial contact chain. Classification request. Diplomatic holding language. Boundary acknowledgement templates. Contamination cautions. Cultural assumptions to avoid. There was, she noted in the part of her mind not currently busy being terrified, no box for ancient cosmic authority arrives claiming to have made everyone. There was, however, Form C9, Preliminary Contact Registry. She opened it. Species designation, pending. Self-identified authority structure, hierarchical. Claimed origin status, disputed. Fleet count, 38 confirmed. Technological category, unknown, highly advanced. Immediate threat posture, indeterminate. Notable communication characteristics, broad-spectrum simultaneous transmission, possible psychoacoustic modulation. She paused at the field labeled Requested Initial Reciprocity. "What?" she murmured to no one. "Do I even put there?" "Coffee?" asked Technician Havel beside her, without looking away from his board. Mara looked at him. Havel was 26, had a stress rash climbing his neck, and had somehow chosen this moment to unwrap a ration biscuit with the stubborn concentration of a man refusing to yield civilization to circumstance. That's not a protocol category. It could be aspirational. Against all reasonable chemistry, the laugh happened then. Inappropriate. Exactly human. It lasted less than a second and did not improve the situation in any material way, but it changed the air in the room. Not because they were no longer afraid. They were afraid. Fear sat in the station like extra gravity. But laughter was something else. A claim. A very minor one, but a claim all the same. Mara returned to the form. Requested initial reciprocity, formal identification, declared intent, technical hazard disclosures, recognized contact parameters. Good enough. On Aster, Admiral Rowe had moved from the glass to the command table. A dozen windows hovered above it, each carrying its own catastrophe. Outer habitats requesting guidance. Colonial governors asking whether evacuation language should be prepared. Trade syndicates asking if border lanes were closing. Religious channels either proclaiming fulfillment or fraud depending on which old book they favored. Internal projections on civil response volatility. Strategic assessments that used long phrases to avoid saying nobody had any idea what the fleet could actually do. Commander Sanaa Pike, Chief of Operations, placed a tablet on the table in front of Ro. High Command wants a response package inside 10 minutes. Ro skimmed the contents. Diplomatic or military? Yes, Pike said. That earned the bridge its second almost laugh. Ro read another page, then another. Do we have a contact acknowledgement template that doesn't sound like we're either surrendering or starting a war? Pike considered. Not a good one. Make a bad one that buys time. She nodded once and turned to the drafting station. Her hands moved fast, precise, almost irritated. Around her, officers and analysts rebuilt themselves into function. Sensor teams mapped. Medical teams sampled stress responses. Intelligence began pulling every record tied to extinct civilizations that had used related symbolic structures. Logistics flagged stockpiles and route vulnerabilities. Somewhere 3 decks down, someone in food services asked whether breakfast cycle was still on schedule and got told yes because the station might be facing self-appointed creators from the abyss, but people still needed to eat. 7 minutes later, the first official human reply crossed the dark. It did not contain reverence. It did not contain panic. It did not contain anything Severith would have recognized as the proper emotional architecture of revelation. It identified the responding authority as the Frontier Defense and Contact Administration of the Human Systems Compact. It acknowledged receipt of transmission. It requested formal registry data, command hierarchy, biosafety disclosure, navigational intent, and recognition of established border protocols. It attached contact procedures, quarantine advisories, and a structured invitation to designate diplomatic representatives at mutually agreed coordinates. At the bottom, because Commander Pike had a very specific sense of humor and Admiral Rowe had approved the text without blinking, there was one final automated note. Your transmission has been logged. A contact representative will review your submission shortly. If your matter is urgent, please indicate priority level in the attached field. The message went out clean. On Watchpost Cinder, Mara watched the confirmation light turn green and thought, with the flat, stunned clarity that sometimes follows impossible decisions, that humanity had just answered a voice from the dark with paperwork. Havel finished his ration biscuit. You think that's going to make them angry? Mara looked out at the crescent of black ships blotting the stars. Probably. He brushed crumbs off his sleeve. Good. Beyond the glass, the fleet held position in the dark as if the universe had paused to see what godlike certainty would do when met, for the first time in a very long time, by clerical procedure. High Consequence Severith read the human reply 3 times. Not because it was difficult, because difficulty would at least have been respectful. The translation was perfectly clear. The structure was brutally legible. Every line of it carried the same impossible implication. The species on the far side of the dark had received revelation and processed it as administration. Registry data. Biosafety disclosure. Command hierarchy. Border recognition. Quarantine advisories. Priority level designation. Attached field. He stood in the light chamber with the human message suspended above the rail in clean white script and felt, for the first time in many years, the distinct internal resistance of a mind encountering a category it did not yet have an assigned place for. His lower eyes narrowed. His upper eyes moved back over the final line. Your transmission has been logged. But not adored. Not feared. Not even contested in emotionally coherent terms. But around the chamber, attendants held still with the exaggerated stillness of those who sensed danger not from enemy action but from the possibility that the person at the center of the room might be experiencing something close to offense. General Caden's bronze skin had darkened by a shade. Terrell's hands were folded inside her sleeves with such precise symmetry that Severith knew she was choosing control by force of training. At least, Caden said carefully, they responded. Severith did not answer at once. He looked through the transparent ceiling at the yellow star and then back to the human text. The old teachings had extensive material on resistant species. The stubborn, the skeptical, the militarized, the ritualistically independent. The doctrine accounted for delays, negotiations, protective aggression, symbolic refusals, performative insolence from local elites, and the temporary confusion produced when minds built around self-authorship first encountered proper scale. It did not account for this. Not because this was stronger resistance. In some ways it was smaller, purer, less dramatic. A refusal so deeply procedural it denied the revelation even the dignity of becoming a crisis. That line at the end, Terrell said softly. I am uncertain whether it was insult. It was structure, Severth said. The answer came out colder than he intended. He disliked that immediately and disliked more that he had noticed it. Emotion ungoverned was useful in lesser creatures and untidy in himself. He placed both upper hands behind his back and let the chamber's harmonic field settle his bioluminescence toward equilibrium. They are still organizing themselves, he said. They remain inside process because process is the only dignity available to minds that have not yet accepted position. Caden inclined his head. Then we move them. Yes, Sever thought. Of course. Revelation was the first kindness. Demonstration was the second. He had not needed demonstration often. The name and the voice usually completed the necessary internal fracture. But not always. The Veral Stonebinders had required orbital rearrangement of their sacred moon before devotional realignment began. The Kelp intelligences of Nerith had continued legal arbitration for almost 11 hours after first address until a section of ocean was raised 300 meters without visible mechanism and held there long enough for theology to become practical. Species learned at different speeds. That variance had never altered the ending. Prepare sacred evidence, Severth said. No one in the chamber moved for half a second. Then everything moved at once. Across the fleet, one vessel separated from the crescent and advanced into visible prominence. It was not the largest ship. It was in some ways more unsettling that it was not. Humanity, watching from border stations and telescopes and civilian screens, had not yet learned the design language of the fleet, but even untrained eyes registered purpose when they saw it. The new vessel was smooth in places where the others were ribbed, symmetrical where the others suggested layered function. Its hull carried concentric bands of dark metal that looked less constructed than grown into obedience. It moved toward a small outer moon in the Halcyon Edge system, an airless body of stone and frozen silicates about 600 kilometers across and useful to no one except surveyors and amateur astronomers. At Boundary Fortress Aster, the tactical room fell quiet as every sensor available pivoted to follow. Commander Pike leaned over the main table. Do we have population on that moon? Negative, said a civilian analyst from Orbital Registry. No permanent infrastructure. No active claim. Survey marker only. Good, Rose said. No one asked what exactly was good about that. The black vessel came to a stop beside the moon and hung there with the composure of a hand resting near something breakable. Then its hull bands opened. Not open like doors. Open like mathematics becoming visible. A ring of pale light unfolded around the ship, thin at first, then intensifying until every screen on Aster dimmed automatically to compensate. The frequencies coming off it sent warning blooms through half the station's sensors. Gravity shear. Space-time distortion. Field compression signatures outside any human engineering framework. On Watchpost Cinder, Mara's scope stuttered and recalibrated 3 times in 1 minute. Havel muttered something about hating elegant things on principle. The moon changed shape. Not quickly. That was the terrible part. Explosions were quick. Impact was quick. Even catastrophe usually had the decency to be obvious in its intentions. This was patient, clinical. The outer edges of the moon began to sink inward as if an enormous invisible pressure had remembered the stone existed and was correcting it. Mountain ridges softened. Crater walls folded. The whole body compacted with stately inevitability while fragments and dust were not thrown outward but drawn inward, absorbed into the process with monstrous neatness. The moon did not shatter. It submitted. Someone on Aster's bridge whispered, Jesus. No one corrected the terminology. For 4 minutes and 9 seconds the compression continued. When it ended, the moon was still there, still in orbit, still reflecting the local star. It was also no longer a moon in any shape nature would have chosen. It had become a sphere. Perfect, mirror-smooth, smaller by nearly half, gleaming in the dark like a polished thought. On civilian networks, view counts detonated. On military channels, no one spoke for 12 full seconds. Then the second transmission arrived. "Witness consequence," said the voice. "Receive scale. You are addressed by those who ordered matter before your ancestors named hunger. Be aligned, and be spared the burden of pretending equality with your source." The signal cut. On Aster, every face on the bridge was turned toward the glass or the tactical feed. Some expressions were openly stunned now. Some were trying not to be. Lieutenant Voss crossed herself once with such speed she probably hoped nobody would notice. The linguist in civilian gray had both hands over his mouth. Somewhere to the left, a console chimed because a public communications queue had overflowed by 3 million messages in under a minute. Admiral Rowe looked at the compressed moon for a long moment. Then he turned away from it and asked the room the question that mattered. "Scientific assessment?" Half the bridge blinked. Then Dr. Len Okafor from Attached Astrophysics Liaison, who had been standing near the rear stations in yesterday's shirt under a borrowed uniform jacket because nobody had expected his night shift to become history, pushed forward with a tablet in one hand and wonder on his face so naked it almost counted as joy. "Sir," he said, breathing hard, "I need permission to be impressed professionally." Rose stared at him. Okafor swallowed. "It's obscene," he said. "I mean that respectfully. If our readings are even half right, they just performed controlled macroscale gravitational compression without destabilizing orbital integrity." "Sir, that—" He stopped, recalibrated himself, and tried again. "That is not just a weapon demonstration. That is a physics event." Pike turned her head slowly toward him. "Doctor." "Yes. They're threatening us." "I know," Okafor said. "I'm saying they're doing it beautifully." A different laugh went around the room then. Still small. Still under tension. More dangerous because of it. Rowe held out a hand. Okafor gave him the tablet. The Admiral read the live analysis summary, flipped to the next page, then the next. "What do you need?" he asked. Okafor blinked. "Need. To understand it." The doctor looked back at the tactical display, at the impossible sphere where a moon used to be. "Time. Proximity. Spectral access. Preferably permission to send questions no one sane thinks they'll answer." Rowe handed the tablet back. "Draft them." Pike looked at him. "Sir?" "You heard the man." The reply humanity sent 23 minutes later crossed the dark informal compact register. It acknowledged observation of the demonstrated phenomenon. It requested clarification on energy source, field mechanics, radiological byproducts, and long-term orbital consequences. It asked whether the transformed body could be approached for remote study under monitored conditions. It further inquired whether the acting vessel would be willing to exchange non-hazardous technical data regarding the compression process for the purposes of scientific understanding and hazard mitigation. At the bottom, attached under Dr. Okafor's signature because Pike had decided the truth was funnier than any joke she could write, was one final line. "The Human Systems Compact Department of Astrophysical Inquiry expresses formal interest in the methodology used and would welcome further technical discussion." On the Sanctum vessel, High Consecrant Severith received the message in absolute silence. He read it once. Then again. Then very slowly looked up at the polished sphere turning in the dark, bright and impossible and perfect beside his ship, and understood that humanity had just responded to divine intimidation with academic enthusiasm. By local morning, the image of the compressed moon had crossed every public network in settled space. Not the official image. Nobody waited for official images anymore. The official feeds were clean and stabilized and tagged and cautious in the language of institutions trying not to set populations on fire. The image that spread was taken from an amateur telescope array bolted to the outer hull of a freight habitat over Maris Belt, grainy at the edges, slightly overexposed, framed badly enough to feel real. In the lower left corner you could see a maintenance arm and the blinking red reflection of the habitat's own warning beacon. In the center of the frame you could see the moon before and after, separated by 16 minutes and one impossible act of physics. The first image looked like a moon. The second looked like a metal bead dropped by some patient giant into the black. The caption changed depending on who reposted it. Somebody folded a moon. Well, that seems excessive. Respectfully, absolutely not. If they do that to Earth, I am not paying taxes first. The last one got 19 million shares in 6 hours. Fear was everywhere. It would have been stupid to pretend otherwise. Emergency goods saw a purchase spike across the inner systems. Civil defense lines jammed. 3 fringe sects declared immediate theological vindication, and one of them also declared the stock market irrelevant, which did not stop its members from selling at a loss before the opening bell. The old religions split in the way old religions always split when the universe did something theatrical. Some called the fleet fraud. Some called it proof. Some called it a test. Some called it exactly the sort of thing their texts had warned about, which was a comfort to them because it meant they had somewhere familiar to put the fear. Scientists had an even worse reaction, which was excitement. Dr. Len Okafor's request packet circulated through the academic channels before anyone could stop it, and within an hour the Department of Astrophysical Inquiry had received 4,000 volunteer sign-ons from researchers offering to assist in analysis of the compression event. By afternoon there were 3 competing papers in progress, 2 simulation projects, 1 petition for a controlled observation mission, and a vicious argument on the new Geneva theory boards over whether the transformed moon counted as a natural object anymore. No one in the argument seemed to think the timing made them unserious. On the contrary, the worse reality became, the more human beings wanted to understand it badly and in footnotes. On Boundary Fortress Aster, Admiral Rose stood in the command-ready room with Commander Pike, a cooling cup of coffee, and a wall screen that insisted on showing him every kind of public reaction the species was currently capable of. A panel of religious commentators shouting over each other. A market analyst trying to explain why orbital shipping insurance had become imaginary. A group of university students on Helix Station filming themselves under an emergency light and ranking alien titles for dramatic quality. A clip of a 12-year-old girl holding up a handmade sign reading "You are witnessed now, please take a number." Pike leaned against the table and watched the feeds with the flat patience of someone too competent to be surprised by public behavior. Command wants a visible statement. Of course they do. Visible, calm, senior, reassuring without making promises. Roe took a sip of coffee, grimaced, and looked into the cup as if betrayed by chemistry. So they want fiction. They want containment. He watched the girl with the sign for another second. How bad? Not catastrophic. Outer systems are rattled. Inner systems are pretending not to be. Civil channels are alternating between dread and jokes every 12 minutes. That sounds healthy. It sounds human. That, Roe thought, was the problem and the solution in the same inconvenient package. He was not a public-facing officer by preference. He liked ships, decisions, and rooms where the number of people who needed convincing remained low. The public always wanted tone as much as fact, and tone was slippery. Too cold and they called you detached. Too warm and they called you dishonest. Too certain and they remembered every wrong thing you had ever said. But Command was right about one thing. If a species-old fleet had just crushed a moon into a polished sphere on the edge of human territory, someone in a uniform needed to sit under good lighting and look insufficiently impressed. The briefing room was prepared in 19 minutes. It had the compact flag behind the podium, a tactical still of the boundary zone on the side wall, a row of seated journalists with the bright predatory stillness of people who knew history had entered the room and wanted quotes sharp enough to survive it. The public stream opened at 1600 hours station time. The audience crossed 30 million before Roe finished sitting down. He did not begin with rhetoric. Rhetoric was for victory speeches and funerals and people seeking office. He began with facts. Yes, the fleet remained outside established boundary lines. Yes, the demonstrated event had been observed and recorded. Yes, the compact regarded the situation as serious. No, there was no evidence at present of immediate fleet incursion. Yes, contact protocols remained active. No, he would not discuss military disposition. No, he would not speculate about worst-case outcomes for the benefit of live view metrics. That earned a low, unpleasant rustle from the press bench, which told him he had found the right altitude. The questions came in sequence. Had the compact ruled out evacuation? Did he believe the fleet's claims about creating humanity? Belief was not a military category. Did the moon demonstration prove the aliens possessed functionally unlimited destructive capacity? Nothing in the universe had functionally unlimited capacity. It simply had capacities beyond current understanding, which was a different and more solvable problem. Did he view the first before flame as hostile? I view anyone compressing celestial bodies during introductions as a party requiring caution. That one traveled fast. He could feel it leave the room while he was still speaking. Somewhere in the feed counters, the quote detached from its source and began making copies of itself. Then the journalist from SolNet asked the question the room had been leaning toward from the beginning. She was young, controlled, and brave enough not to hide that her hands were tight around her tablet. "Admiral," she said, "do you personally think they are what they claim to be?" The room went still. Not because everyone cared what one officer believed. Because everyone understood that answers to questions like that, spoken under pressure and carried live to half the species, had a way of becoming more real than they deserved. Ro looked at her. Then at the camera. Then briefly at the still image on the wall behind them, the polished sphere where a moon used to be. He thought about the voice in the station bones. He thought about technicians fighting nausea and doing their jobs anyway. He thought about Okafor practically vibrating with scientific hunger. He thought about a little girl on a public feed holding up a handwritten demand for cosmic bureaucracy. When he answered, his tone was level enough to sharpen glass. "I think," he said, "that anything demanding worship this early in the conversation is selling something." The room held its breath for exactly 1 second. Then the sound hit. Not laughter from the journalists, not at first. The first reaction was the sharp involuntary noise people make when relief collides with fear and produces energy with nowhere decent to go. After that came the noise everywhere else. Across public channels the line detonated. Memes within 4 minutes, shirts within 20, a remix on the student networks before the hour ended. Someone cut the phrase over footage of the compressed moon turning in the black and somehow made it feel mocking. On Boundary Fortress Aster, Mara Denev watched the clip on a side screen while monitoring the fleet and felt the station around her exhale in microscopic increments. Not calm. Nothing like calm. But shape. The fear had shape again. That mattered. Havel, who had found another ration biscuit from somewhere disreputable, chewed once and nodded at the screen. That's a useful sentence. Mara kept her eyes on the tactical display. 38 ships still hanging across the dark, still enormous, still impossible, still there. Why? Because now everyone knows what kind of conversation this is. On the far side of the boundary, inside a chamber built to prepare bodies for awe, High Consecrant Severith received the translated clip from human public channels. He watched it once. Then once again. The words were simple. The audience reaction required no translation. Not the language around it. The emotional architecture. Not reverence. Not collapse. Not even coherent blasphemy. Something more alien than all of those. Humor. Not because they were unafraid. Because they were afraid and had still reserved the right to frame the moment themselves. For the first time since entering human space, Severith felt something under the offense. Not confusion. That had a name. Not anger. That had names enough for a small library. This was narrower and sharper and more dangerous, precisely because it was directed inward as much as outward. He looked through the chamber glass at the polished sphere of the moon turning beside the ship that had made it. 46 species had seen sacred evidence. 46 had understood scale. 46 had begun, in one form or another, to kneel, and now beyond the dark, on feeds and stations and kitchen walls and schoolyard screens, humanity had watched a moon be folded into obedience and answered by making the line into a joke they could carry in their mouths without choking on it. The chamber lights shifted over Severith's skin. Gold withdrew. Something colder took its place. The second day was quieter than the first, which turned out to be worse. Noise had uses. Panic had motion. Even the endless public churn of commentators and experts and frightened citizens inventing certainty for the sake of their own nervous systems had a kind of mercy in it. Noise gave the mind surfaces to strike. Quiet did something else. Quiet made room. Boundary Fortress Astor returned, outwardly, to function. Shift bells rang on time. Corridor lights cycled through station morning and station noon and station evening according to schedules that had not been written with cosmic claimants in mind and saw no reason to apologize now. Mess service remained operational. The bread at breakfast was slightly stale because resupply from the inner lanes had been delayed by 12 hours when Freight Control decided that moving fuel and medical stock mattered more than pastries. This produced 3 separate complaints and 1 sincere debate in the lower mess about whether the universe ending should improve or worsen bakery standards. Mara Denev ate 2 slices anyway. Across from her, Havel was trying to read a public analysis thread while holding a spoon in his mouth. "There's a professor on New Geneva," he said around the spoon, arguing that if they really built all living systems then their public messaging team should still be fired. Mara chewed. "Useful contribution. It has 12 million approvals. That's more people than agree on anything." The mess screens were muted but still impossible to ignore. The compressed moon rotated in one corner of every feed package, glossy and unnatural and offensively calm in its orbit. Beside it rolled public reaction metrics, academic requests for observational access, faith leaders disagreeing at historical volumes, market stabilization attempts, and one looped clip of Admiral Rose saying anything demanding worship this early in the conversation is selling something. Every time the line came around, half the room looked up without wanting to. Not because it made them less afraid. Because it told them what shape the fear had. After breakfast, Mara returned to Watchpost Cinder and found the station exactly as she had left it. Too cold near the outer bulkhead, too warm by the relay racks, 3 scopes live, 1 temperamental, and the dark still full of 38 ships hanging outside the boundary line with the patience of old predators or old priests. It was never quite clear which image felt more dangerous. "Overnight report," Havel said, handing her a tablet. "No movement. No new transmissions. 2 more universities submitted technical questions. Someone from the Compact Arts Council requested permission to classify the compressed moon as a cultural monument." Mara took the tablet. "Denied. Repeatedly." "Good." She slid into her chair and brought the tactical display into focus. The fleet looked wrong no matter how often she viewed it. The human mind likes objects that seem to justify themselves, that reveal function in shape, that carry enough familiarity to let instincts find a place to stand. The black vessels denied all of that. They were not chaotic. Chaos would have been easier. They were deliberate in a way that refused human categories. Too symmetrical in some places. Too smooth in others. Their arrangements still suggested language when seen from wide enough scope. Their stillness had become the station's second gravity. The danger, Mara was learning, was not always in what large things did. Sometimes it was in what they were willing to wait for. On Astor's main command deck, Admiral Rose stood at the tactical glass with Commander Pike and 6 hours of accumulated reports flattening into order around them. "Civil channels?" he asked. Pike skimmed a summary pane. "Fear stabilizing into behavior. Supply runs up. Localized religious agitation. Humor remains annoyingly robust." "Good. You keep saying that." "Because I mean it." Pike did not look up from the pane. "You think jokes are a strategic resource. I think anything that prevents a population from letting the enemy write the emotional script is a strategic resource." That earned him the smallest sideways glance. She turned the pane. "Then our strategic resource is flourishing." The summary was absurd and therefore encouraging. 30 million downloads of a satirical song built around the words "you are witnessed." 3 counterfeit merchandise lines claiming to be officially licensed by the Department of Astrophysical Inquiry. A children's puzzle game on the public nets called Border Protocol where players filed forms at increasingly dramatic invaders until they either left or declared themselves. A swarm of artists turning the polished moon into album covers, protest posters, devotional icons, and one shockingly tasteful T-set pattern. The fear had not gone anywhere. It moved under all of it like current under ice. But humans, Ro knew, had a long history of refusing to approach fear directly when side door methods were available. They mocked what towered over them not because mockery made them strong, but because it kept them from surrendering the right to frame what they saw. That right mattered. It always had. Movement? He asked. Pike's expression changed by 1 degree. Enough. One contact, she said. Small by their standards. Separating from the crescent. The main glass shifted. A vessel was peeling away from the alien formation. Not one of the largest. Not one of the ritual ships. A narrower craft, still immense by human construction standards but modest relative to the black mountains behind it. It angled toward the contact boundary and accelerated with smooth contempt for the kinds of inertia human engineers had spent centuries learning to negotiate politely. Ro watched it for 3 seconds. Signal. Ready. Send the notice. The official boundary advisory crossed the dark in clean compact protocol. Unidentified vessel approaching regulated contact line. You are entering restricted transit space under active first contact control. Reduce speed and return to prior position. Continued advance will be interpreted as a deliberate violation. No threat language. No excess. Ro disliked warning labels that tried to sound dramatic. If force became necessary, force would make its own argument. The vessel did not slow. On watchpost Cinder, Mara watched the contact marker move across her scope and felt the old frontier arithmetic waking up behind her ribs. Distance. Time to threshold. Time to weapons range if this became that kind of day. Time to station lockdown. Time to discover whether all the calm on the upper decks was earned or theatrical. Beside her, Havel stopped chewing gum. That was more informative than most alarms. Boundary in 90 seconds, he said. I can read. I'm helping. She magnified the feed. The vessel came on like a blade drawn slowly enough to make the point last. There was no visible weapon bloom, no active field surge that the scopes could isolate. Just motion and the ugly confidence implied by it. The contact line, visible only as a construct on human screens, meant nothing physically. Meaning is not usually physical. That never stopped it from mattering. Any change from Aster? Havel asked. Mara checked the command channel. No. That was the part she could not get comfortable with. No rush in the command traffic. No frantic all-hands language. No sudden cascade of emergency code phrases. Orders were moving, yes, but with a pace so controlled it bordered on impolite. Certain platforms shifted sensor orientation. Certain civilian lanes were being redirected by freight control for reasons labeled routine traffic harmonization. 2 maintenance windows near the outer dark had been extended without explanation. A salvage tug convoy that should have been nowhere near the contact zone had altered vector 3 hours earlier and was now sitting in empty space with its transponders muted. None of it said anything on its own. Together it said something she did not know how to read. That was what frightened her most. Not that command was afraid. That command might have been waiting. On the far side of the dark, in the light chamber of the sanctum vessel, High Consecrant Severith watched the scout advance and felt the first clean edge of his own uncertainty. Not fear. He named that immediately and rejected it. Not yet. The human broadcasts had been insolent. The forms, the questions, the market of jokes built around sacred speech, all of it remained structurally offensive. But offense could be answered. Demonstration could be escalated. Scale could be increased until even this species, with its distressing habit of turning dread into commentary, remembered the correct arrangement of itself. And yet, the human response pattern had not shifted. Even now, with a scout crossing their declared boundary, they were not throwing frightened language into the dark. They were not posturing, not begging, not rushing. The signal traffic carried from their stations remained measured, compressed, disturbingly free of the emotional distortion he would have expected from minds properly aware of inferiority. It was possible, he told himself, that they were simply masking badly. It was possible. The scout crossed the boundary. On every human scope in the sector, the contact marker moved cleanly past the line. Ro did not blink. Send second notice. The second notice went. More direct. Return now. The vessel advanced. Mara watched the marker close another band of distance. Her palms had begun to sweat against the console. Around her the watchpost had gone into that brittle, narrow quiet stations have right before history decides whether to become casualty math. 30 seconds, Havel said. The contact reached a point 17,000 kilometers inside the regulated zone. Then it vanished. No weapons flash. No debris. No thermal bloom. No impact signature. 1 second it was there on every scope in the network, sharp and black and impossible. The next it was gone in the simple, obscene way only deliberate things are ever gone. Mara stared at the empty coordinates. Havel stared too. What, he said very softly, was that? On Astor's command deck, no one asked the question out loud. That was another kind of answer. The report of the vanished scout reached the Sanctum vessel in 19 seconds. High Consequence Severith read it once. Then again. Then a third time, not because the words required interpretation, but because repetition was the mind's oldest method for trying to force reality back into the shapes it had occupied a moment earlier. The report did not improve with rereading. The vessel had crossed the human boundary. Human warnings had been issued in their dry administrative language. The scout had continued. Then at a precisely recorded coordinate 17,000 kilometers inside regulated transit space, the vessel had ceased to exist as an active contact. No weapons bloom. No debris pattern. No reactor flare. No transmission from the crew. Gone. Around the light chamber, the silence thickened. General Caden was the first to break it. Retaliation. Not a suggestion. A category. Terrell kept her hands inside her sleeves. We do not yet know mechanism. We know insult. We know loss, Terrell said. Those are not identical. Caden's skin darkened toward iron. They removed a consecrated vessel from existence without declaration. Severith said nothing. He looked through the transparent ceiling at the yellow star and let the arguments move around him like weather around stone. Retaliation would be doctrinally clean in one sense and disastrous in another. They had not come to conquer. Not exactly. Conquest was a lower, cruder language. They had come to reorder, to reveal, to place a species into the proper understanding of itself. Civilians destroyed in anger would not strengthen revelation. They would contaminate it. The distinction mattered. It had always mattered. But the scout was gone. And the humans, intolerably, had offered no explanation. He turned back to the chamber. Call the outer consecration flotillas. Caden's eyes sharpened. All of them? All of them. The answer moved through the chamber like a current. Within the hour, new mass signatures began appearing beyond the original crescent. At first 3. Then 7. Then 12 more in simultaneous emergence patterns, so precise the border scopes stuttered trying to classify them. The arrivals did not trickle in. They arrived in doctrinal geometry, each new black ship stepping into place around the first formation with the patient force of a second thought becoming inevitable. On Watchpost Cinder, Mara Deneuve watched the count climb and felt her body go cold from the spine outward. 39. 42. 50. 58. The numbers kept going. Every border platform in the Halcyon line was now feeding live to Astor under total command lock. Civilian channels had been cut out of raw tactical imagery, though public summaries were still going through because humanity preferred its fear with timestamps. The new vessels formed a wide encircling ring around the first arrival group. Not sloppy. Not aggressive in the familiar human sense. Worse than that. Intentional. Written all over again, but in a different sentence. Havel leaned over his board and did the arithmetic everybody else was already doing. That's not reinforcement, he said. Mara did not look away from the scope. No. That's a conclusion. By the time the arrivals stopped, the fleet count stood at 112. On Astor's main tactical glass, the contact zone looked infected. Commander Pike read out the final numbers without inflection because panic improves nothing and she had spent too many years in uniform to lend theater to bad facts. 112 confirmed hulls. Original 38 holding primary crescent. Additional 74 in outer closure pattern. Range to Aster still outside direct strike envelope if current vectors hold. Admiral Rowe stood with both hands behind his back and regarded the impossible mass on the glass the way a surveyor might regard storm damage. Reading it, not reacting to it. Civilian movement? Outer lanes redirecting under emergency freight authority. Habitats 3 through 9 are beginning hard shelter cycling. Good. Public channels are calling this a siege. Rowe considered the tactical display for another 2 seconds. Public channels are dramatists. This is doctrine. Pike looked at him. You understand how little better that sounds. Yes. The bridge remained quiet around them, but not the quiet of paralysis. Systems traffic ran fast and low. Authentication tags flashed. Logistics approvals moved through old secure pathways that had not been used in 17 years. Fleet registries were opening in deep command layers. Outer maintenance arrays blinked in patterns Mara on Cinder would not understand for another few hours. The station had the feeling of machinery rotating into engagement one hidden gear at a time. Still, no grand announcement came down from command. No species-wide speech. No declaration of last stands or sacred frontiers or anything else people in histories always claim someone said before everything changed. Just work. That, more than the fleet, kept Mara's fear sharp. Because work suggested plan. And plan suggested that somewhere above the level of her clearance, someone had expected this. At 1611 station time, a single human vessel emerged from Aster's shadow and advanced into the contact zone. It was not large by fleet standards. Not next to the black walls hanging beyond the boundary. It was a compact line battleship, old but heavily modified, a blunt-shouldered mass of armor and engine with none of the alien elegance and all of the human preference for ships that looked like they expected to be hit. Its registry transponder burned across the scopes with perfect honesty. HCS Vigilant Frontier Command attached. The ship advanced 200,000 kilometers ahead of Aster and stopped. One ship. That was all. On Watchpost Cinder, Havel actually laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because the mind sometimes refuses scale by making noise at it. Mara kept staring at the contact marker for the Vigilant sitting alone in front of 112 alien vessels. Do we know why that ship? No. Do we know who's aboard? Senior Command Channel says Rowe transferred across at 1400. That got her attention. When? Quietly. Of course, she thought. Quietly. Why would anything enormous happen in a normal way today? On the Sanctum vessel, Severith stared at the single human warship holding position at the center of the widened contact geometry and felt something inside his thinking tighten. One ship. Not retreating. Not massing reinforcements in visible lanes. Not transmitting surrender language. Simply there, blunt and armored and offensively singular in front of a fleet that should have rendered singularity an extinct concept. General Caden spoke what the chamber was already thinking. They want us to see it. Yes, Severith said. It is provocation. It is communication. The channel request came from the human vessel before Caden could answer. Not broad spectrum. Not public. Direct command frequency, properly tagged, properly authenticated, stripped of every decorative layer. The kind of signal sent by people who had no interest in performance and every interest in being understood. Severith accepted. The audio opened. No music. No harmonic architecture. No psychoacoustic pressure. Just a human breath somewhere close to a microphone and the low structural murmur of a ship under load. Then a voice. High Consecrant Severith, said Admiral Elian Rowe. This is Frontier Admiral Rowe aboard Compact Vessel Vigilant. You have expanded armed presence in violation of established contact boundary. State intent. Around Severith, no one moved. The sheer audacity of the phrasing required a moment. He answered in his natural voice, not the consecration voice, because some instinct older than doctrine had decided this conversation would not survive theater. You removed one of my vessels. Rowe's reply came without haste. You crossed a declared line. You think lines create authority? No, Rowe said. People do. that landed harder than it should have. Severith looked at the one human ship on his scope. You stand one vessel deep before 112. Is this meant to signify courage? There was a pause on the line. Not the pause of uncertainty. Selection. No, Rose said at last. It signifies an answer. Severith's skin shifted along his arms, gold tightening toward white. You have been offered alignment. We reviewed the offer. And? Rose's voice did not rise. That was the worst thing about it. He said the sentence as if reading a completed form. No. The open channel held. On the bridge of the Vigilant, men and women did not breathe. On watchpost Cinder, Mara felt her own pulse in her teeth. In the light chamber of the Sanctum vessel, something moved through Severith's chest that his language possessed several adjacent words for and none exact. Rage, certainly, but not only rage. Offense elevated by disbelief. Certainty discovering friction. A lifetime of revelation meeting a species that could apparently feel fear, calculate odds, understand scale, and still preserve the right to refuse. He gave Ro one final chance because doctrine, even now, required structure. You understand what stands before you. Yes. You understand what will follow. Another pause. Then, with almost unbearable plainness. Yes. That was the moment the old formula broke. Not when the scout vanished. Not when the humans filed their forms. Not when they made jokes out of sacred language. In the clean, impossible space where a species looked at overwhelming force and said, yes, we see it, yes, we understand it, no anyway. Severith closed all four eyes for one measured second. Then he opened them and said, very softly, then receive consequence. The channel died. Across 112 black ships, weapon systems woke. The first volley from the Lantern of Origins turned night into a second sun. It did not begin as one beam or one impact or anything so modestly understandable. It began as convergence. Across the black hulls of 112 vessels, apertures unfolded and rings of pale geometry widened, and the dark itself seemed to pull backward from what was about to happen. Human scopes screamed warnings before any weapon had technically fired. Energy levels climbed through 3 separate red bands and into a fourth that most compact tactical software reserved for reactor breaches, stellar flares, and theoretical situations engineers used to scare each other during training. On the bridge of the Vigilant, nobody looked away from the main glass. Admiral Rowe stood with one hand on the command rail and watched the enemy fleet finish making up its mind. Mark, he said. Commander Hale at Tactical did not answer with words. Just a sharp press of his station and the sending of a coded burst so compressed and narrow it looked like static in the vastness between ships. The volley struck. On watchpost Cinder, Mara Denev made a sound she would later deny making. The scopes lost the Vigilant entirely in the bloom. A sphere of white violence erupted where the lone battleship had been, so bright every station in the sector dimmed its displays and still failed to make the image humane. The light expanded in a hard-edged shell, then thickened into a roiling mass so dense with energy signatures that individual components stopped meaning anything. Thermal load, plasma shear, gravitic fracture, radiation spiking across 10 bands, some of them not yet identified. It was not a strike. It was an argument in favor of erasure. Havel gripped the edge of his console hard enough for his knuckles to bleach. Nothing survives that. Mara didn't answer, because the part of her that wanted to agree was in open conflict with the part of her that had spent the last 12 hours noticing how quietly command had moved. On the Vigilant, alarms filled the ship with red sound and red light. The deck under Rose's boots lurched so hard the nearest comms officer hit a bulkhead and bounced off it. The bow shields vanished from the board in one impossible instantaneous collapse, and the secondary lattice took the load a fraction of a second later with a howl through the hull so violent it stopped sounding mechanical and became animal. Forward envelope gone. Portside ablatives shedding. Reactor stable, hold the line. Rowe did not raise his voice. Time. First package release in 32 seconds. The main glass was white. Not brightness anymore, not exactly. Pressure given color. The Vigilant had been built 31 years earlier and redesigned in the last 11 months by people who had read the old projections and decided survival was worth ugliness. Whole interior decks had been stripped for field mass. Elegant redundancies had been removed in favor of blunt ones. The hull had been layered until every naval architect involved either signed a waiver or wrote a protest. The ship was no longer efficient. It was stubborn in metal form. The first enemy barrage hit again. Somewhere aft, something blew out with a cracking report that sent a ripple through the deck plating. Lights on the port side vanished. The bridge dropped into alternating red emergency strips, and the tactical projection over Hale's station flickered twice before returning with a section of it blacked out. Shields at 19%. Hold them, Rowe said. We are holding them, sir. It came out half as a protest, half as prayer. On the Sanctum vessel, High Consequence Severith watched the fire where the human ship had been and waited for the only possible outcome. He did not feel satisfaction. Satisfaction required tension resolved properly, and this still sat wrong in him. But it would end. The one ship would vanish. The species that had turned revelation into forms and sacred scale into jokes would be reminded, brutally if necessary, that meaning did not belong to them simply because they mocked what exceeded them. General Caden leaned over the tactical display. Direct hit across all arrays. Severith watched the contact at the center of the blast. Yes. No debris escape pattern. Yes. The white mass began to thin. And the human ship was still there. It appeared through the clearing blaze like a thing carved out of refusal. Hull blackened almost to charcoal. Entire forward sections burning. Portside armor peeled back in strips. One engine plume reduced to an angry sputter. No vessel that size should have retained integrity under that load. No vessel of any size should have retained narrative under that load. And yet the contact marker burned steady beneath the damage report like a sentence refusing revision. General Caden stared. Impossible. Severith did not answer. Because on the outer edges of the formation, in the places his fleet design treated as safe by geometry, new contact signatures were appearing. At first 5. Then 11. Then 23. Then all at once, as if a curtain had been drawn back from empty space and revealed intent hiding in the folds, 41 compact attack craft and stealth corvettes lit their engines inside the dead zones of the Lantern Formation. On Astor's command deck, Commander Pike exhaled once through her nose and said, to nobody in particular, there you are. The Shadow Fleet had been in position for 9 weeks. 9 weeks in silence. 9 weeks of dark running inside predictive gaps the Compact Strategic Office had identified before the first public contact message was ever sent. The old planning cell had studied the projected geometry of a Revelation fleet the way chess players study arrogance. Large vessels made shadows. Ritual formations made assumptions. Assumptions, under enough pressure, became blind spots. 41 smaller ships had slipped into those blind spots one by one under salvage tags, maintenance masks, sensor wash, and freight signatures so boring that even a suspicious observer would have resented finishing the file. They had waited there with drives cold and transponders ghosted and crews living on recycled air, dry rations, and the most carefully rationed silence in compact history. All for this. The first compact strike hit a Lantern battleship from below and behind, exactly where its shield architecture assumed nothing hostile could exist. The impact did not destroy the vessel. That was not the design goal. It punched through propulsion control and drive synchronization, stripping movement from a ship the size of a city in one surgical burst. 2 seconds later 3 more strikes landed on adjacent hulls. Then 7. Then 12 in a rolling sequence that moved through the black formation not like panic but like method. On Watchpost Cinder, Mara's scope transformed from nightmare to revelation so fast her brain needed 3 full breaths to catch up. Friendly contacts everywhere. Not new arrivals. Old arrivals. Hidden arrivals. The icons bloomed from empty sectors and geometry shadows and maintenance corridors between impossible enemy masses, all of them compact tagged, all of them firing inward through angles the alien defenses had not bothered to cover because no sane opponent should have existed there. Havel was laughing again now, not because he was calm, but because he was very much not. We were hiding in their own blind spots. Mara's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. Yes. My God. No, she said, and the answer came so naturally she barely noticed she'd said it. Ours. Inside the sanctum vessel, the chamber had exploded into motion. Drive loss on Vessel 17. Weapon lattice collapse on Consequent 3. Impacts from internal vector, repeating, internal vector. Caden was shouting for reorientation orders already made obsolete by the time they left his mouth. The Lantern Fleet had been designed for supremacy, for revelation, for lines of force projected outward at fearful distances. It had not been designed for enemies hiding inside the mathematics of reverence. Defensive arrays swung too slowly. Targeting grids choked on impossible bearings. Return fire lashed in confused arcs that found mostly empty dark and, twice, their own ships. Severith stood in the center of the storm and watched decades of inherited certainty come apart under the pressure of one brutal human question. What does an empire of overwhelming force stop seeing because it has never had to look for it? Angles, apparently. On the Vigilant, the third barrage struck and failed to finish the work. The ship screamed around the bridge, metal under strain, bulkheads redistributing stress in noises no living structure should make. A panel burst near the rear comm pit and showered sparks across 2 crew members. Someone yelled for damage control. Someone else answered that damage control was already drowning. Time. Rose said again. Commander Hale's face was red in the emergency glow. Strike package fully active. Enemy mobility kills confirmed on 19. Weapons hard disabled on 11 more. Additional impacts propagating. Keep pressure on command hulls. Yes, sir. The main glass now showed a different kind of light. Not one ship dying under divine punishment. A whole doctrine being revised in fire. Compact corvettes knifed between crippled lantern vessels, firing precision bursts into drive throats and weapon spines before vanishing again into the chaos of the formation. Larger attack ships emerged only long enough to gut a shield node or blind a command array. The point had never been annihilation. The point was paralysis. To take away movement. To take away certainty. To leave the crews alive inside their ships long enough to understand what had just happened. A mug slid off a side console, struck the deck, and shattered. No one looked at it. On the Sanctum vessel, Severith finally understood the shape of the trap and hated its elegance more than he hated the damage. The human ship at center had never been there to win. It had been there to be watched. To gather every eye in his fleet on a single act of apparent defiance. To make the formation focus forward, emotionally and tactically, while 41 hidden vessels held still in the dark behind the assumptions revelation required. The Vigilant had not needed to triumph. It had only needed to live. And it was living still. Another strike tore through a command relay 3 ships to port. Another lantern vessel lost thrust and drifted sideways, colliding with a crippled companion in dreadful slow silence. The chamber lights shifted across Severith's skin, gold and blue giving way to something he had no ceremonial name for. General Caden turned toward him, eyes wide in a way Severith had never seen in 71 years. Orders. The question echoed strangely in the chamber. Outside, the Black Fleet burned in pieces. Inside, for the first time since entering human space, High Consequent Severith had no answer ready enough to sound like faith. Battles that matter rarely do. They taper in layers. First the certainty goes, then the formation, then the ability of the people inside the remaining ships to agree on what the next minute is for. Across the contact zone, black vessels that had entered human space in perfect doctrinal geometry now drifted under damaged thrust, weapons cold or misfiring, command relays blinded, propulsion knots sheared open by strikes designed not to destroy belief cleanly but to leave it alive long enough to feel itself failing. On Watchpost Cinder, Mara Deneuve watched the tactical board reduce itself toward truth. 112 hostile contacts had become 63 functioning, then 31, then 17 with full maneuver authority, then 12 holding position in a ragged tightened cluster around the Sanctum vessel like creatures rediscovering the idea of huddling. The rest were dead, disabled, or so stripped of movement and fire control that they no longer counted as active participants in anything except their own education. The Vigilant was still there, scorched nearly black along the port quarter, venting atmosphere in 3 intermittent plumes, one engine burning at a reduced, unstable output, forward shield systems gone, half the outer hull lit in heat bloom like a coal refusing to cool. Mara kept finding the contact marker again and again, as if disbelief were a habit her mind had not yet broken. Havel sat down hard in his chair for the first time in 40 minutes. We lived. Mara kept her hands on the console. Some of us did. He nodded once. That was enough agreement for now. On the bridge of the Vigilant, the silence after the last coordinated lantern fire felt louder than the barrage had. People moved in it carefully, as if noise might tempt the universe back into one more round. Damage teams flooded section reports up the chain. Medics crossed the aft stations with burn kits and pressure wraps and one portable respirator that had seen too much history in too little time. Commander Hale had blood running from a cut above one eyebrow and seemed unaware of it. Enemy return fire degraded to non-coherent scatter, he said. No new target lock. Admiral Rowe stood with one hand against the command rail because the deck had developed an occasional low shudder and there was no sense pretending otherwise. The remaining 12? Holding. Defensive posture only. Sanctum vessels still powered. No charge building on main arrays. Hidden group status? 31 operational. For mission kill. 6 damaged but mobile. Strike package completed. Rowe nodded once. Not satisfaction. Accounting. Open a channel. Hale looked up. Broad. No. Direct. The signal crossed the dark from one ruined command ship to another. High consequence Severith accepted without consulting anyone. For a moment the channel carried nothing but ship sounds. The human vessel's structural complaints, the altered hum of a wounded drive, the soft-clipped movement of people still working. On the Sanctum side, harmonic systems had shut down when the fighting turned ugly. What remained was bare machinery and breath. Rowe spoke first. Your move. Severith closed all 4 eyes for the length of one inhalation. Not because he needed composure, because he needed to identify what, precisely, had just broken. General Caden was still talking somewhere to his left. A relay adept was demanding target verification from systems that no longer had anything useful to verify. Terrell had gone silent altogether, which frightened him more than Caden's anger. The tactical display still showed the one human battleship where it had no right to be, half-burned and underpowered, and yet somehow more impossible now than before the weapons exchange. One ship. That fact had acquired a different shape. Not tactically. Tactically the shape was obvious enough now and would hurt for generations. A trap built from patience, silence, geometry, and the astonishing human willingness to let fear sit in the room without handing it the pen. That part would be studied if there were institutions left with the authority to study anything. The deeper damage sat elsewhere. He had spent 71 years learning species. Learning the structures inside which fear settled and made itself useful. Every civilization they had harmonized feared differently in surface details and identically in fundamentals. Fear organized itself into devotion, obedience, supplication, rationalization, gratitude for the hand that did not close all the way. Fear generated compliance. Compliance, prolonged long enough, began impersonating belief. The distinction had mattered academically. It had never mattered operationally. Now, staring at the Vigilance contact marker through the flicker of failed ships and drifting wreckage, Severith understood that humanity had just introduced a new variable into a 4,000-year equation. Not fearlessness. That would have been easier. He knew now, with the humiliating clarity of post-error insight, that the humans had been afraid from the beginning. The patterns were obvious in retrospect. Elevated pulse markers in intercepted bridge footage. Chemical stress spikes. Civilian panic buys. Border crews gripping consoles hard enough to leave residue for their own forensic teams. The young one on the secondary watch deck whose pupils had stayed blown wide for most of the engagement. Even the admiral, probably, somewhere below the level at which expression was permitted to interfere with function. They had been afraid. And they had done it anyway. That was the thing his language had lacked. Not because it was a rare courage. Rarity he had words for. Valor under unequal force. Endurance in the sight of sacred power. Defiance born of ignorance. Noble futility. Terminal insolence. Languages built by empire always had many terms for the ways smaller beings tried and failed to preserve dignity. What his language did not have was a clean word for afraid and know anyway as strategy rather than accident. Because no species in 4,000 years had ever made that answer survivable long enough to become contagious. He opened his eyes. "Do not return fire," he said. General Caden turned so fast his lower limbs scraped the chamber floor. "High Consecrant, do not return fire." The chamber held the words like impact. Outside, 12 lantern vessels and 1 ruined human battleship regarded each other across a field full of doctrinal wreckage and frozen certainty. No one fired. The silence that followed was not mercy. Mercy belonged to moral narratives both sides were too disciplined to indulge cheaply. It was information. And information, once properly delivered, had a habit of continuing its journey without anyone's permission. On Aster, the first anomalous report from Dominion space arrived 6 hours later. The source was weak, the packet irregular, piggybacked across old trade relays and flagged first by an intelligence filter built to notice tribute traffic fluctuations. A routine shipment from the Morith systems had failed to depart on schedule. That was all. No sermon. No uprising. No warfleet. Just a ship that had always been loaded on cycle and this cycle was not. 2 hours after that, an administrative maintenance request from the Orthal Temple Network failed authentication because the listed local authority had been removed from office by the Population Assembly. The reason field was short. Service no longer required. By the second day there were 14 such reports. Tribute delays. Temple closures. Missing devotional attendance logs. Regional liaison offices reporting civic hesitation, in language so frightened of itself it practically glowed. An entire mining moon in the old Veral sectors had simply stopped broadcasting the daily revelation back to central doctrine channels. No explanation. Just silence where ritual had been. Compact intelligence stopped calling them isolated irregularities around report number 9. On the third day, a signal came through on one of the lantern's own sanctified frequencies. Not from the Vigilant. Not from any compact asset. Not from a military source at all. It came from a minor moon under Dominion authority, population 12 million, no standing navy, no strategic resources worth a fleet, governed for 6 centuries through the steady pressure of ritual and tribute and the daily bone-deep certainty of the voice. The packet was only 1 word long. It crossed a holy channel no subject people had ever used in all the recorded centuries of Dominion administration. Compact analysts decrypted it, checked it again, then sent it upward in total silence. The word was no. Nothing else attached. No demands. No manifesto. No explanation. Just the smallest and oldest refusal in civilization, lifted at last and applied to a target it had apparently never occurred to anyone they were allowed to use it on. On Watchpost Cinder, Mara read the intelligence summary twice and then passed the tablet to Havel without comment. He read it and sat very still. "Do you think they know what happens next?" he asked. "Who?" He looked down at the tablet. "Any of them." Mara turned back to the scope. The contact zone was quieter now. Salvage operations beginning at the edges. The 12 remaining lantern vessels still holding in diminished formation while negotiations no one below certain clearance levels would ever hear in full moved across secure channels. The Vigilant still there, half broken and stubborn, surrounded by escort signatures at last. "No," she said. "I think they know what happened." That, she suspected, was enough. Across Dominion space, system by system, species by species, the old equation was being tested against a new fact. A thing can be feared and refused. A fleet can survive being told no. A holy frequency can carry different words. The contagion was not military. It did not move by liberation flotillas or triumphant speeches or the broad redrawing of maps. It moved the way deeper things move. Through kitchens. Through loading docks where tribute ships did not get loaded. through temple doors that remained shut because nobody wanted to open them first, through long conversations held after work by people who had never before allowed themselves to phrase the question clearly, through the terrible, exhilarating recognition that the impossible had happened somewhere else and therefore belonged now, however uneasily, to the category of the possible. In the sanctum vessel's light chamber, stripped of its performance harmonics and half-lit by damaged systems, High Consecrant Severith stood alone after the others had gone. The tactical display had been cleared. The wrecks were no longer visible. The chamber glass looked out on ordinary stars and on the yellow system light beyond, warm and unconsulted. He stood with both upper hands resting against the rail and thought about what, exactly, he had offered humanity. Alignment. Relief from self-definition. Entry into an order older than choice. He had believed every word. That remained, perhaps, the most painful part. Not the destroyed ships. Not the collapse of fleet doctrine. Not even the spreading refusals now rippling backward through the very peoples he had spent a lifetime harmonizing. Painful, yes, but procedural. Losses could be counted. Doctrine could be rewritten if one still had the right to write it. What sat like a shard under his breathing was simpler. He had mistaken compliance for confirmation. And the humans, with paperwork and jokes and one wounded battleship that had lived long enough to make defiance public, had forced the distinction into history where it would not leave. Outside, the stars burned. Inside, Severith stood in the dim remains of a chamber built to prepare bodies for awe and listened to the silence where certainty used to live. The Vigilant came home on a Thursday. Not because Thursday meant anything. The yard clocks above Halcyon Dry Dock 3 would have called it Thursday whether history had changed shape or not, and history, as Mara Deneuve was learning, rarely paused to line itself up with names people gave to days. The return window had shifted twice. First because the Vigilant's portside armor had fused itself into a problem the dock crews wanted examined before they risked towing stress across the inner ring. Second because 3 of the hidden strike corvettes were limping home on damaged drives and Compact Doctrine, unlike Dominion Doctrine, did not leave its own people to make a cleaner entrance. So it was Thursday. Dry Dock 3 received the ship without ceremony. No bands. No speeches. No choreographed rows of officials pretending they understood what kind of thing had just come back through the gates. Just work lights, mag clamps, tug drones, hull crews in magnetic boots, and the low industrial hum of a civilization that had decided survival was best honored by getting very practical very fast. Mara stood on the observation platform with station transfer orders folded in one pocket and watched the Vigilant settle into cradle position. Up close the ship looked worse, which she found oddly reassuring. Burn scars ran the length of the hull in black-gray fans where the first barrage had tried to peel it open. One engine housing was so warped it looked softened. Along the port quarter, armor plating had crystallized into ugly glassy textures no human shipwright had ever intended to see outside a theory sim. The vessel did not look triumphant. It looked like it had been told no by physics and answered not yet. Havel came up beside her carrying 2 paper cups and handed her one without comment. The coffee was terrible in the honest institutional way that meant no one had wasted effort improving it for symbolic occasions. "They're saying no compact fatalities," he said. Mara kept her eyes on the hull. "I saw. You cried?" "No. Liar." She took a sip. "Maybe a little." Below them, dock crews moved over the ship in disciplined swarms. Not reverent. Not careless. Curious, focused, alive to detail. One woman in a hull inspection harness stopped near the crystallized plating and laid a gloved hand against it for a moment before calling down readings to the materials team. Nearby, a maintenance tech took 3 photos and sent them somewhere marked priority science. Another pair argued about stress fractures with the quiet intensity of people who considered exact language a moral obligation. The galaxy had just watched a fleet of self-declared makers lose its certainty in public. Humanity's first instinct, Mara thought, was apparently still to start paperwork and inspect the metal. It made a kind of sense. Behind her, the yard screens rolled the wider aftermath in muted windows. Tribute routes from former Dominion systems remained disrupted. 3 more temple networks had suspended daily revelation broadcasts. A provisional compact aid office had opened channels to any subject populations requesting technical, medical, or agricultural support, and requests were already arriving faster than anyone liked. Across 30 systems, there were arguments now about governance, belief, memory, truth, reconstruction, and what exactly a people owed itself after spending generations being told what it was for. No one knew how any of that ended. That, too, made a kind of sense. Admiral Rowe appeared only once on the dock level, moving from the disembarkation ramp toward a secure transit lift with Commander Pike and 2 intelligence officers half a step behind him. He did not pause for cameras because there were no cameras close enough to be rude. He looked tired in the specific way of a man who had run out of reasons to perform not being tired. One sleeve was scorched near the cuff. His face remained composed, but composition after impact was a different thing than composition before it. As he passed below the platform, he looked up once and saw Mara and Havel watching. He did not wave. He simply inclined his head, small and exact, the acknowledgement of one working professional to 2 others. Then he kept walking. Havel stared after him. You think he's going home? Mara thought about it. About after-action reports. About casualty reviews. About command briefings and political hearings and all the other unglamorous machinery that followed any event important enough to alter maps. No, she said. I think he's going to another room full of people who need him to explain why saying no worked. Havel considered that. You think he can? Mara looked back at the Vigilant in its cradle, blackened and ugly and real. I think he already did. That night, back in her quarters, she opened a channel to her younger brother on New Carthan. He was 16, clever, annoying, and had sent her 12 messages in 4 days pretending not to be scared. The call connected on the 3rd try. His face appeared in the screen haloed by the bad apartment lighting of someone who had not once in his life valued aesthetics correctly. You look tired, he said. You look undereducated. She grinned. Then the grin softened. Mom said you were fine. Mom says weather is fine during structural collapse. Fair. He hesitated. Mara saw the question arrive before he asked it. Were you afraid? There was. Not the public question. Not what did they look like or how big were the ships or did you really watch a moon get folded into a sphere. The real one. The one that sits under all the others and waits until there is enough quiet for honesty. Mara leaned back in her chair. Yes, she said. He nodded once, as if some part of him had needed the answer to be that and nothing else. Then why, he asked, did everybody keep acting so normal? She looked at the dark window beside her desk. Past it, Dry Dock 3 hung over the planet in its quiet wheel of light. Somewhere inside its framework the Vigilant rested in clamps while welders and analysts and med teams and supply officers did the long ordinary labor that follows surviving something extraordinary. Beyond that, in the larger dark, former Dominion systems were trying on new sentences about themselves and not yet sure which would fit. Because normal, she said slowly, is one of the ways you remind a thing it doesn't get to own the whole sky. He was quiet at that. So what happens now? Mara let the question sit for a moment. Good questions deserved that much. Now, she said, people build what comes after. On the screen, her brother nodded again, this time with the serious look he wore only when something had landed deeper than he expected. They talked a little longer about smaller things after that. Food. Transfers. Whether she was finally going to sleep for more than 5 hours. Whether he was still pretending his coursework did not need attention. Ordinary talk. Human talk. The kind that keeps history from becoming the only thing in the room. After the call ended, Mara sat for a while in the station quiet. Outside, the dock lights held steady around the battered shape of the Vigilant. Farther out, the stars burned with the same indifference they had shown before the fleet arrived, before the boundary speeches, before the polished moon and the hidden corvettes and the holy frequency carrying one impossible word. The stars did not witness. They did not judge. They did not sell anything. They simply burned. And in their light, humanity went on doing the thing it had always done best when confronted with darkness large enough to make worship seem tempting. It kept going. With bad coffee. With tired hands. with cracked hulls and longer reports and arguments about bread and reconstruction budgets and what freedom costs after you have made it visible. It kept going. Not because it was unafraid, because it was afraid and had learned at last that fear did not get the final draft.